Today we're making quick and easy craters. How are you today? Artjeremiah here, and I'm back with another quick and easy terrain building tutorial. So here's the deal. I've watched and read many tutorials on building craters, and none of those really suited my needs for a quick and easy crater. Usually they involve a lot of drying time and things like that. I'm just not a really huge fan of spending hours and hours on a simple piece of terrain. So I've formulated a consistent, quick, and easy method that you can use too. Stay tuned until the end of the video to catch my whole process. I started out by cutting some 1-inch thick circles of XPS foam. These range from about 4 inches to 6 inches in diameter, just to give some variation to the terrain pieces. I used a hot wire cutter to cut these circles out, but that isn't really necessary. You can use a knife or whatever method you have of cutting foam. I'm using a relatively cheap Wagner heat gun I picked up from the hardware store, but if you would like to help support the channel, I do have Amazon links in the description of low-priced heat guns. You really won't regret the purchase if you plan on working with foam a lot. If you don't want to buy a heat gun, you can even use a kitchen torch or a candle. They're just a little bit less consistent. For safety reasons, you will want to wear a respirator and work in a well-ventilated area. I will have one of those linked in the description as well. Burning styrofoam can produce a variety of chemicals that can be deadly and cause both short-term and long-term damage to humans. So this step is vital for your health. So anyway, using our heat gun, we form indentations in the middle of each of our circles. We are going to try to make everything relatively deep, but try not to melt all the way through to the other side. Sometimes the foam will bubble. I just use a blunt object, basically whatever I have on hand, to smooth out all the bubbling. Then I use my cheap serrated knife and I rip and gouge the outside of each crater. I basically just angled the outer rim of each crater and then saw a bunch of lines into the foam. These lines aren't really necessary, but I do like to add them just to give a little bit of action element to the craters, if that makes sense. It's more of a design aspect than a realism aspect. I then run the heat gun around the outside of each crater. I don't really want to heat things too much, just melt down some of the jagged spots as well as give everything a hardened shell. Sometimes the heat will warp the bottom a little. If that's the case, just flip it over and apply the heat gun to the middle of the bottom of the crater. Just a second or two should be good enough to make the crater sit flat again. If you're getting something from this video, then don't forget to give me a like. That not only makes me happy, but it pushes it out to more crafters like you and me. These are already starting to look like craters, but I really want the inside of the craters to have a bit of action as well. So for that, we're going to be using some Spackling compound or filler. The instructions say not to have full contact with your skin, so I do always make sure to wear gloves when working with Spackling compound. I apply the filler to the middle of each crater. Then, using my finger, I add streaks in the Spackling compound going from the middle out. That will give the build a little bit more detail and action to look at. Then I want to add a little bit of rubble to each of the craters. I glue some ripped up cork inside all the craters, as if little rubble rolled back inside after whatever explosion or impact created these craters. You could add some bits of sand if you wanted as well, or even add some rubble to the outside rim of the craters for a more realistic look. And this is what we end up with. I set them aside to dry for about an hour before working on them again. That will be more than enough time for the Spackling compound and glue to dry, but it really can be workable sooner depending on what compound you are using. Since this video, I've actually been using the pink stuff that turns white as it dries, and it's often ready in about 15 minutes or so. Now I mix up some high-grade PVA glue and black paint. You can also use Mod Podge and black craft paint if that's your preference. Then I apply it to each crater with an old brush. I like to wear a glove at this stage, that way I can handle each crater without leaving too many fingerprints. That layer will take a little bit to dry. I usually leave it overnight or something like that, but that isn't really necessary. You should be able to get these craters done in one little hobby session. For this set of craters, I'm doing a pretty basic paint job. I started off by doing a heavy overbrush of gray. I'm actually wet blending two of the different grays into each other, though it's a little hard to see it on camera. One gray is just lighter than the other, and it helps give a little bit of variation to the build. I also wet blend some burnt sienna into the grays, just to give the paint job a little bit more of an earth and rust look. Next, I do a creamy dry brush of antique white. This gives everything a warm highlight, brings out the details, and makes the gray look not so dull. Okay, I'm going to be using an airbrush in the next step, but that isn't really necessary. It's just a lot faster to attain the look that I'm going for. So, with my airbrush, I'm going to add a layer of black transitioning out of the center of each crater. This is going to give the illusion of depth and give each crater a scorched look. Like I said, you can get a similar effect with a brush. Just add a dab of paint to the middle of each crater and brush your way to the outside of each pit. The brush will get drier as you work your way towards the outside and should naturally transition to the gray. I can demonstrate that in a little bit later video. It's not quite the same as the airbrush look, but it will do the job. And this is what we end up with. If you want a more detailed build, you could add some grass or sand or snow, depending on the landscape you're going for. You can even mount these on a base for a little extra weight and protection. Thanks so much to the patrons. Without your continued support, this channel would most likely be no more. If you'd like to take your support to the next level, then feel free to join me on Patreon. That'll give you access to things like an Etsy discount code and a few extra videos, as well as seeing what's going on with certain projects that I'm doing. And you can easily find that by checking out the link in the description of this video.